September 17, 1941. The Pulkovo Heights, south of Leningrad. Dawn is a gray smear over a gray landscape. The air is sharp with the smell of wet earth, decaying leaves, and the distant, ever-present tang of cordite. Unteroffizier Erich Schultz is motionless, his cheek a cold weld against the stock of his Mauser Kar 98K. His world is reduced to the circular view through his Zeiss scope. He has been scanning the Soviet line for 47 minutes, and he is beginning to doubt his own eyes. His mission is textbook. Identify a command post, a machine gun nest, a communications trench, a seam in the Soviet defense to unpick. His training is impeccable. He looks for the geometric, the man-made, the straight line of a trench parapet, the angular shadow of a bunker, the predictable movement of men along a communication line. But the earth before him refuses to cooperate. It is a chaotic, pockmarked morass. What from a distance looked like disorganized shell craters now resolves, frustratingly, into something else. He sees dips, mounds, scattered shallow depressions, but no lines, no trenches. It is a lunascape, devoid of logic. A whisper of movement. A helmet? He tightens his focus. It's a torn piece of canvas, flapping on a shattered branch. The wind sighs through the no-man's land, but nothing else moves. To his left, his spotter, Gefreiter Hennig, lowers his binoculars, blinking slowly. "It's a wasteland," Hennig murmurs, his voice hoarse. "They've dug in like animals, like groundhogs." Schultz doesn't answer. He feels a prickle of professional irritation, edged with a colder, deeper unease. This isn't how the enemy is supposed to behave. The Red Army is a brutish, monolithic force. They dig deep, yes, but in predictable, massive works. This is madness. A defensive line that isn't a line at all.
He shifts his gaze 100 meters to the east, a slight depression, possibly a firing position. He marks it, calculates the range, 380 meters. A straightforward shot for a marksman of his caliber. But there is no target, just a hole in the ground. To fire is to reveal his position for no guaranteed gain. It is an affront to his sniper's calculus. Suddenly, a rifle crack, flat and sharp, breaks the stillness. It doesn't come from the depression he was watching. It comes from his right, far to his right. A spurt of dirt kicks up 30 meters ahead of their position, a ranging shot, wildly off. The product of poor training, or... The realization dawns, cold and slick. Or it came from a position so isolated, so unconnected, that the shooter had no lateral support, no spotting help. A lone man in a lone hole. Hennig tenses. "Contact, bedding 85 degrees, approximate." "I heard it," Schultz whispers. "But where is he?" They scan, sector by sector. Nothing. The Soviet rifleman has already vanished, having slithered back into the labyrinth of dirt. He wasn't in a trench you could enfilade. He was in a hole, a solitary, deep foxhole. And for the first time, Erich Schultz understands the true shape of his problem. He isn't hunting soldiers in a defensive line. He is hunting ghosts.
The German forward observation post was a masterpiece of precision in a world that had rejected it. A carefully sandbagged pit with clear sight lines to pre-registered map coordinates, linked by a deep, zigzagging communication trench to the support line. Lieutenant Vogler, an artillery observer, peered through his stereo Scherenfernrohr scissors periscope, his map spread on a makeshift table. His job was to call down fire on Soviet strongpoints, but you cannot call down fire on a question mark. "Grid square 7-8 Delta," he said into the field telephone, his voice strained. "Request battery fire, 1 round, for observation." The crack thump of the 10.5-centimeter howitzer echoed from behind. Seconds later, a geyser of black earth and frozen soil erupted precisely where Vogler had directed. The explosion was satisfying, destructive. It would have obliterated a section of trench. Here, it simply left a new, steaming crater in a field already covered in them. Vogler watched intently. No panicked figures spilling from a collapsed trench, no secondary explosion from an ammunition cache, no movement at all. The crater now just blended into the surreal topography. He had corrected for wind, for range, for every variable in the ballistic equation. He had not corrected for an enemy that refused to form a discernible shape. His frustration was a physical taste, coppery and sour. The Soviet Hedgehog defense wasn't just a tactic, it was a psychological solvent, eating away at the very logic of German warfare. Their doctrine, the Blitzkrieg, relied on identifying a Schwerpunkt, a center of gravity, a decisive point to strike. What was the point here? Every hole was independent. Destroying one did nothing to the next. It was like trying to kill a hydra by focusing on a single scale.
Back at the sniper's nest, Schultz and Hennig were learning the same lesson the hard way. A machine gun, a Maschinengewehr 34, had opened up from their front earlier that morning. Its distinctive, ripping sound had come from a mound of earth near a shattered birch tree. They'd pinpointed it, called in a mortar team. The Granatwerfer 34's bombs walked in, and the mound vanished in a cloud of dirt and splinters. Silence followed. An hour later, the same ripping sound, but now it came from a position 200 meters to the left, near a ruined wagon. It was the same gun, or its twin. The Soviet crew had simply waited, then crawled, not through a trench, but through the grass, through dips and folds in the earth invisible to the German eye, to a pre-prepared secondary hole. They had moved without being seen, because they had moved without standing up. There was no parapet to silhouette against. Hennig let out a low, exasperated breath. They're not defending a position, Unteroffizier. They are the position. Schultz finally lowered his rifle, his muscles screaming from sustained tension. The cold was seeping past his greatcoat. He thought of the proud, linear fortifications of the French Maginot Line, so easily outflanked. He thought of the clean battle maps at headquarters, with neat red and blue lines. Those lines were a lie here. The battlefield had become organic, fungal. The Soviet soldier had ceased to be a unit on a map and had become part of the very soil, emerging to strike, then dissolving back into it. And in that moment, a darker thought crystallized. If you cannot find a target, you cannot impose your will. If you cannot impose your will, you are not advancing. You are simply waiting. And on the outskirts of Leningrad, as autumn began to bite with winter's teeth, waiting was a game the Germans could not afford to play. The tactical stalemate was complete. But in the frozen silence, a new and more intimate horror was about to reveal itself.
The silence was the worst part. Not the profound quiet between barrages, but the active, watchful silence that now pervaded the German lines. It pressed against the ears. Men jumped at the sound of a shovel striking a rock. The confident banter of a few weeks ago had dried up, replaced by low whispers and thousand-yard stares directed at a landscape that seemed to breathe malice. Obergefreiter Weber, a veteran squad leader, found himself lecturing fresh replacements, his words painting a picture his own mind struggled to grasp. "Forget everything you learned at training camp," he'd growl. "There is no front line here. There is only here," he'd jab a finger at his own feet, "and out there." A sweep of his arm towards the scarred earth. Out there is a constellation of individual men, each in his own star crater. He has no one to his left or right. He cannot run, so all he can do is wait for you. And they did wait, with a patience that felt alien, inhuman. German patrols sent to probe and map this hedgehog field would move with textbook caution.
Yet always the attack came from where they had just been. A single shot from behind a mound they'd already passed. A lone fléchette rifle grenade arcing out of a depression marked "clear" on the map. The casualty reports told a frustrating story. Wounds to the back, the side. Men were being picked off not in a storm of frontal assault, but in a series of perfect, isolated ambushes. It was a sniper's paradise, but only for the sniper who required no escape route. One evening, a low groan carried across the frozen mud. A German soldier, separated from his patrol in the fading light, had stepped into a wolf grube, a simple, spike-lined pit trap, primitive and brutal. His leg was pierced. His cries for help were a siren song. As his comrades prepared a rescue, a debate raged. It was a classic trap, but to leave him was unthinkable.
They went for him, under a smokescreen, and as they struggled to pull him free, a single, well-aimed shot from nearly 400 meters away struck the rescuing medic in the shoulder. Not a killing shot, a crippling shot. Now there were 2 men in the kill zone. The Soviet rifleman wasn't just killing, he was multiplying logistical problems, draining morale, consuming time and resources with a single round. Back at the observation post, Lieutenant Vogler received a new, grim order. If he could not find discrete targets, he was to saturate sectors with fire. Flächenfeuer, area fire. It was an admission of defeat. It was artillery reduced to the role of a blind man swinging a club. They would pulverize acres of earth, wasting precious shells on the chance that a man might be hiding in one particular hole. The artillery barrages would roar, the earth would tremble, and after the dust settled, the watchful, infuriating silence would seep back in, followed, inevitably, by another solitary shot from an area just declared cleared. The psychological toll was becoming tactical reality. German infantry, renowned for their initiative, began to grow passive, hesitant. Advancement wasn't halted by a wall of steel, but by a quagmire of doubt. Every crater could hide a rifleman. Every mound could conceal a machine gun with a lone, patient crew. The battlefield had become a hall of mirrors, each reflecting a tiny, deadly fragment of the war. And then the snow began to fall. First a few flurries, dancing in the iron-gray sky, then a relentless, heavy blanket that smoothed the edges of shell holes, draped the frozen mounds in white, and transformed the landscape once more. To the Germans, it was a new layer of misery. To the men in the hedgehog holes, shivering in their white camouflage smocks, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Now they weren't just part of the earth. They were ghosts in a sheet of white, aiming at men who stood out like charcoal strokes on clean paper. The balance of invisibility had just tipped decisively, and Erich Schultz, scanning a suddenly monochrome hellscape through his scope, would make a discovery that would turn his professional frustration into something very much like fear.
The snow did not just fall, it consumed. It rendered the world silent, sterile, and profoundly two-tone. The blinding white of the earth and the grim dark gray of the sky. For Erich Schultz, the lens of his scope became a window into an optical illusion. Every gentle hump of snow was a potential helmet. Every shadow in a hollow was a potential rifle pit. Paranoia, once a professional tool, became a constant companion. Then he saw it, or rather, he saw nothing where something should be. Ahead, about 250 meters out, a low ridge. Along its crest, the snow was smooth, pristine, except for one small, almost imperceptible patch, a patch where the snow seemed thinner, darker, as if the ground beneath was breathing, giving off the faintest whisper of warmth. There was no shape, no outline, just a subtle textural wrongness in the flawless white. Schultz's finger hovered over the trigger, his crosshairs rested on the spot. But what was he aiming at? A thermal anomaly? A trick of the light? To fire was to break the supreme discipline of the sniper, certainty.
As he watched, the anomaly moved, not with the jerk of a man, but with the agonizing slowness of a glacier. A fraction of an inch to the left. The only sound was the pounding of his own blood in his ears. This was no frantic soldier. This was a predator, so in tune with its environment it could move between heartbeats. Then, from a different location entirely, a shattered tree stump 150 meters to the right of the anomaly, a muzzle flash, tiny and bright in the gloom. The crack of the Mosin Nagant reached them a split second later. Down the line, a shout. A lucky or horrifically skilled round had found a gap in a machine gunner's shield. Schultz whipped his scope back to the ridge. The anomalous patch was gone. The snow was smooth. The ghost had fired and vanished, not by retreating, but by simply settling, by becoming one with the landscape again. "Did you see?" Hennig whispered, awe and horror mixing in his voice. "He used a dummy position, a heat lure. He knew we might be looking for that. He drew our eyes while his comrade—" "Yes," Schultz cut him off, the word tight.
This was the evolution. This was no longer just about hedgehog holes. This was a masterclass in applied camouflage and psychological warfare. The Soviet sniper wasn't just hiding. He was designing the battlefield. He was creating scenes, using the environment as a prop, manipulating the Germans' expectations against them. The heat signature may have been a carefully placed stone, warmed by a hidden candle, or a bottle of tepid water. A cheap, simple tool to command the focus of a man with 1,000 Reichsmark scope. A profound shift occurred in Schultz's understanding. The enemy sniper was not his opposite number. He was not playing the same game. The German sniper was a technician of death, relying on superior optics, meticulous ballistics, and disciplined procedure. The Soviet sniper was something else, a phantom, a tactician of terror whose primary weapon was not the bullet, but uncertainty itself. He didn't need to hit every time. He just needed to make every German soldier feel the crosshairs on his back from a direction he could never pinpoint. Reports trickled back, adding to the tapestry of dread. Sentries found dead at their posts, a single small-caliber hole in the forehead with no sound of the shot ever heard. The Soviet snipers were using subsonic ammunition or positioning themselves at such extreme ranges that the bullet arrived before the sound. They were engineering auditory illusions to match the visual ones. The frozen front of Leningrad had birthed a new kind of combat. It was asymmetrical before the term existed. The mighty German war machine, built for rapid movement and decisive Kesselschlacht, cauldron battles, was being bled dry by 1,000 tiny, invisible cuts. Each solitary foxhole was not just a defensive position, it was an independent kingdom of resistance, ruled by a soldier who was part sniper, part survivalist, part specter. And in the headquarters maps, the neat blue arrow representing Army Group North was not halted by a bold red defensive line. It was simply fading, stuttering, bleeding its strength into the endless, hungry white. The siege was turning inward. The hunters were becoming the hunted, trapped in a maze with no walls, waiting for a shot that would come from nowhere and everywhere at once.
The casualty reports ceased to be mere numbers and became a chilling narrative of their own. Not pages listing the fallen in heroic assaults, but a drip feed of grim personal tragedies. Gefreiter Helmut Fischer, shot through the neck while boiling coffee. Obergefreiter Johann Bauer, killed by a single round to the chest while inspecting a wire fence. Unteroffizier Peter Schmidt, a veteran of France and Poland, dead from a wound to the leg that severed an artery. A wound inflicted by a random, harassing shot from over 500 meters away. Each name was a man who had survived the hurricane of Blitzkrieg, only to be picked off by the silent, frozen breeze of Leningrad. Morale, that invisible armor, began to crack and flake away. The forward trenches, once bustling with a tense energy, grew hushed and still. Men moved in a low crouch, even behind their own lines. The act of looking over the parapet became an act of profound courage. A new slang entered the lexicon: der weiße Tod, the White Death. It was attributed to no one sniper, but to the phenomenon itself, the creeping, cold certainty that an unseen eye was always upon you. Lieutenant Vogler, the artillery observer, sat in his bunker staring at a map now covered in frustrated red circles and arrows that led nowhere. The very concept of a front had dissolved. His superior had just relayed a desperate, impossible order: to soften up the Hedgehog field for an infantry push. How do you soften a sponge? How do you breach a mist? "We will saturate grid squares 8C through 8E, Lieutenant Vogler said into the field telephone, his voice hollow. "All batteries, fire for effect. Duration, 10 minutes. The ensuing bombardment was apocalyptic. The earth for a kilometer churned and roared, a continuous eruption of snow, dirt, and flame. It was the hammer of the gods. When it ceased, the silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with the echo of its own violence. Surely nothing could have survived. The infantry went over the top at 1400 hours. They advanced in textbook skirmish lines, a gray wave against the white. For the first 100 meters, nothing. Only the crunch of boots on frozen, scorched earth. A collective, tentative hope began to rise. Perhaps the hammer had worked. Perhaps the ghosts had been exorcised by sheer, brutal volume.
Then, from the left flank, a stuttering pop-pop-pop of a Soviet PP Shaw 41 submachine gun. Not from a pre-bombardment position, but from a fresh, unseen hole dug during the night, just behind the crest of a shallow rise the artillery had overshot. 2 men fell. The line wavered. Then, from a blackened, shattered shell hole directly in the center of the advance, a hole that had just been pulverized by a 150mm shell, the muzzle of a Mosin Nagant emerged like a venomous snake. A shot, a squad leader crumpled. The advance stalled, then fragmented into clusters of men taking cover in the very craters their own artillery had made. They were pinned down, not by a wall of fire, but by a dozen isolated, independent threats blooming from a landscape they had just annihilated. The Hedgehogs had not been destroyed, they had been scattered, each surviving soldier now a deeper, more determined island of resistance. The German infantry was not fighting an army, they were trying to extinguish a field of scattered, stubborn embers, each one capable of burning them. By nightfall, the companies had withdrawn to their start lines, having gained less than 300 meters of useless, pulverized ground. The cost had been catastrophic. Not in territory, but in belief. The men had seen their most powerful weapon, coordinated crushing artillery, rendered futile. The myth of German tactical invincibility bled out into the Leningrad snow that night. For Erich Schultz, witnessing the failed advance through his scope was the final proof. This was not a problem of marksmanship or observation. It was a philosophical defeat. They were fighting the 20th century's most advanced military war against an enemy employing the tactics of the most ancient, most relentless of hunters, the hunter who waits, the hunter who becomes the land. As a deep, bitter freeze set in with the darkness, a new sound occasionally echoed across the no-man's land. Not a rifle shot, but the faint, mournful strain of a Russian accordion, a bayan, playing from somewhere deep in the Hedgehog field. It was a sound of profound defiance, of life stubbornly clinging on in a world of death. It was also, for the listening German soldiers, a sound of terrifying normalcy. Their enemy was not just surviving in that frozen maze, he was making himself at home. The Siege of Leningrad would drag on for years, a titanic struggle of attrition and starvation. But here, in the peripheral fights for its outer defenses, a quiet revolution in warfare had already been won. The professional technological hunter had been outwitted by the adaptive, invisible prey. And as the winter of 1941 tightened its grip, the German High Command was forced to confront a paralyzing truth: you cannot defeat what you cannot see.
You cannot order what you cannot comprehend. The path to Leningrad was not blocked by a wall, but by a concept, and concepts are bulletproof.